Gulf War Illnesses, a documentary analysis of White House records, 1995 to 1997. Introduction. The documents before us are declassified presidential records from the Clinton administration, spanning January 1995 through November 1997. These materials were housed in the Clinton Presidential Library and released under the Presidential Records Act and Freedom of Information Act. The collection is titled Gulf War II, 1, and originates from the First Lady's office, specifically from files belonging to Melanne Verveer. According to the withdrawal redaction sheet, dated to case number 2013-0534-S, many individual letters and memos have been redacted under Restriction Code B6, which the document explains as materials whose release would constitute a clearly unwarranted invasion of personal privacy. What remains visible provides insight into how the White House coordinated the federal response to unexplained illnesses reported by Gulf War veterans between 1995 and 1997. Document Walkthrough the Washington Post. Editorial. April 11, 1997. The collection begins with a newspaper clipping. The headline reads, "Sloppy and Unreliable," a Washington Post editorial published on Friday, April 11, 1997. The editorial opens with this assessment. The latest admissions relating to U.S. troops' exposure to chemical weapons in Kuwait and Iraq in 1991 have taken us to an entirely new place. It now is clear that, with intelligence available to the government since at least 1986, the exposure could and should have been avoided. The editorial states that the CIA and Defense Department had been complicit in a Stonewall, if not a cover-up. It references a statement by acting CIA Director George J. Tenet, who said their performance should have been better. The Post describes this as insufficient. The editorial explains that thousands of Gulf War veterans reported symptoms including debilitating fatigue, joint pain, skin rashes, many suspected nerve gas exposure. The editorial states that, for 5 years, Pentagon officials at every level insisted that no such exposure could have taken place. Then, the document says, in June of the previous year, officials acknowledged that U.S. troops destroying Iraqi munitions after the war had unwittingly blew up weapons containing sarin nerve gas at a depot known as Qamishiyah. The editorial notes that estimates of exposed troops grew from 400 to possibly over 20,000. It quotes Senator J. Rockefeller, who said U.S. troops were badly served by both the CIA, which produced sloppy, unreliable, and sometimes contradictory intelligence, and the Defense Department, which even when confronted with intelligence reports warning of chemical weapons, did nothing about it. The editorial ends by stating, "The government will have a hard time now persuading any veteran to accept its word on that." White House Memoranda, 1995, Memo, from Diana Zuckerman to First Lady Hillary Clinton, February 10, 1995. This memo is marked confidential and begins, "You asked me to look into the issue of Gulf War illnesses as a result of the letters the White House has been receiving, as well as the concerns directly raised with you by citizens." The memo is titled, Summary of Gulf War, Illnesses Issues. It states, many Gulf War veterans believe their country has forgotten them. The memo provides the following background. 697,000 U.S. troops served in the Persian Gulf War in 1990 to 91. Many had flu-like symptoms during and after deployment. Concerns about chronic illnesses emerged more than a year later. Symptoms described include chronic fatigue, memory loss, rashes, difficulty sleeping, gastrointestinal disorders, sensitivity to chemicals, respiratory problems, recurrent infections, headaches, joint pain, tumors, and unusual bleeding. The memo states, nobody knows what has caused these symptoms, and it is likely that there are several causes, some of which may interact with each other. Possible causes listed include toxic byproducts from oil fires and tent heaters, depleted uranium, unapproved vaccinations and anti-nerve gas, compound pyridostigmine, infectious agents, chemical and biological warfare, pesticides, microwaves, special paints and solvents, post-traumatic stress disorder or stress. The memo notes, What is particularly unusual is the growing number of reports of spouses and children who also appear to be ill with similar symptoms, as well as reported miscarriages and birth defects. However, it states that the VA and CDC believe that there is no evidence to support these complaints based on limited available data. VA and DoD registries. The memo describes two registries established by law. 1. VA's Persian Gulf War Veterans Health Registry. 2. DoD's registry. The memo references a September 30th, 1993 report by the Office of Technology Assessment, OTA, which stated, "The registries are not well coordinated. They cannot be used to determine cause and effect relationships. They emphasized oil fire exposure and were much less useful for examining other potential exposures. Medical testing was not relevant to the diagnosis of disorders that have now been associated with the mystery illnesses." As of the memo's writing, more than 337,500 of the 697,000 troops were veterans. Approximately 40,000 veterans were enrolled in the VA registry. 85% of those enrolled were sick. Symptoms reported: 17% fatigue, 17% rashes, 14% unusual headaches, 14% muscle or joint pain, 11% loss of memory, 8% shortness of breath. NIH Workshop, April 1994. The memo references an NIH workshop where experts concluded Gulf War veterans were suffering from undiagnosed illnesses of unknown origins, but that there was no single entity that could be reasonably called Gulf War syndrome. They recommended more research. Defense Science Board Report, June 1994. The memo describes a report chaired by Dr. Joshua Lederbergs, which concluded no evidence that U.S. troops were exposed to chemical or biological weapons. The overall health experience of U.S. troops in Operation Desert Storm was favorable beyond previous military precedent. The report was criticized because it was based on DoD reports considered not credible. It stated that less than 0.1% of Gulf War troops reported undiagnosed illnesses, and Dr. Lederberg's selection was criticized due to financial ties to DoD. Institute of Medicine Report, January 1995. The memo states that an IOM interim report concluded research was needed, criticized VA and DoD research as not adequately peer-reviewed, and questioned the quality of data. In Senate reports, Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, December 1994, chaired by Senator J. Rockefeller, the report concluded, investigational drugs and vaccines were inappropriately distributed. DoD obtained FDA permission to use pyridostigmine and botulism vaccine in ways not proven safe or effective. U.S. troops were not adequately informed of risks. The vaccines and drugs probably would not have provided adequate protection. The report expressed concern that pyridostigmine may have caused adverse reactions in some individuals, or may have enhanced the toxic effects of insecticides or other chemicals that were widely used in the Gulf. Senator Donald Regal, Jr. issued reports claiming that Allied troops were exposed to chemical warfare, resulting from Scud missile attacks or U.S. military bombing of Iraq's chemical warfare plants at a time when downwinds were unfavorable. First Ladies' Meetings, January 1995. The memo describes meetings the First Lady held with DoD, VA, and HHS officials. It states, the agencies have been very engaged in addressing this issue. However, the memo notes a problem. Some of the research that the law requires to be conducted by independent researchers under grants from DoD was mistakenly being conducted by DoD. Deputy Secretary John Deutsch assured the First Lady this could be corrected, suggesting NIH might assist with peer review. A letter dated February 7th from Deutsch assured the First Lady that $5 to $10 million would be spent on this peer-reviewed research. The memo also states, agency officials report that they are doing their best under difficult circumstances and feel besieged by Congress and the media. They claim that anecdotes, while compelling, do not constitute scientific evidence, and that Congress and the media are taking these anecdotes too seriously. In contrast, well-respected scientists testified before Congress that these anecdotes should be considered case studies and may be the first sign of significant health problems that will become obvious when research is finally conducted. Veteran service organizations. The memo describes meetings with the American Legion and veterans of foreign wars. American Legion, the legislative director, himself a Gulf War veteran with undiagnosed illnesses, rejected the theory that stress was the main cause. He recounted an incident as a missile launch officer in North Dakota in the early 1980s, describing it as far more stressful than his Gulf War service. He said he read more books during his months in the Persian Gulf than he did during his entire college career. He described pesticides sprayed everywhere, including on cooking utensils, and expressed concern that the combination of exposures could have been much more toxic than any would have been individually. Veterans of foreign wars. The national commander praised the administration's response, stating it was faster than the 15 years it took to get anything for Agent Orange. However, a VFW survey of more than 2,000 Gulf War veterans found most have undiagnosed illnesses that are not being successfully treated. The memo notes, this is not a random sample, but it is worrisome nevertheless. The VFW does not blame the VA, but they believe that the DoD is not providing VA with the information it needs to help determine the causes of these illnesses. Veterans and family members. The memo summarizes letters and phone calls from Gulf War veterans and spouses. One recurring theme is that doctors at individual VA facilities minimize the seriousness of the symptoms, are not well informed, and sometimes ignore the law requiring VA to provide free medical care. A February 9, 1995, letter from the president of the Gulf War Veterans of Massachusetts is quoted, describing veterans as bitter and concluding they will never get help from the VA system. It also includes the complaint that a registry exam doctor had never heard of depleted uranium and did not believe the veteran about exposure. The memo also describes reports of cancer among young Gulf War veterans, deaths from heart conditions, and a belief among veterans that the VA and DoD have not provided full and accurate information about deaths and diagnoses. The memo states, some staff from the agencies concur, off the record, with that assessment. It adds, there is currently no statistical evidence of an abnormally high number of cancers or heart disease among Gulf War veterans, but there are DoD and VA staff who claim off the record that there are worrisome data that have not been made public as yet, and that need to be analyzed by CDC or independent researchers. Lack of effective treatment. The memo describes treatment challenges, stating that many of the undiagnosed illnesses do not respond to treatment. Examples include diarrhea lasting 3 years, rashes that do not respond to treatment, and sensitivities to chemicals that make it impossible for some veterans to go to gas stations or sit in hospital waiting rooms. Women married to Gulf War veterans reported constant vaginal infections and pain related to sexual intercourse. The memo notes that the VA does not provide medical care to spouses, meaning many of these women do not have access to medical tests or treatment. Some veterans sought care in the private sector. The memo states that some Gulf War veterans complained that VA and DoD facilities were too conservative in their testing and treatments, refusing to use diagnostic tools such as SPECT scans and brain mapping, or treatments such as vitamins or plasmapheresis. The countervailing view presented in the memo is that private sector doctors may be taking advantage of the desperation of Gulf War veterans by selling useless or even dangerous diagnostic tests or treatments. Academic experts consulted stated that there are no good diagnostic tools for determining chemical exposures to the brain, and that diagnostic tools such as PET scans and brain mapping have limited usefulness. Compensation. The memo explains that veterans with service-connected disabilities are entitled to monthly benefits, with the maximum benefit at that time being approximately $23,000 per year for 100% disability. Approximately 14,000 claims had been filed by Persian Gulf War veterans, and about 10% were for environmental hazard exposure. Very few of those claims were granted. In November 1994, President Clinton signed Public Law 103-446, which for the first time made veterans whose illnesses were not diagnosed eligible to receive compensation if they could prove they were disabled as a result of military service. First compensation checks were expected in March 1995. The memo notes that proving disability may still be difficult, and that it would be essential to monitor the program to ensure veterans received the compensation they deserved. Working as a team. The memo states that among VA, DoD, and HHS officials and Gulf War veterans, there was agreement that more research was needed. It references laws signed by President Clinton in October and November 1994, including research on the possibility that veterans' health problems could be transmissible to spouses and offspring. The First Lady suggested that Secretary Perry and Secretary Brown visit sites together to demonstrate the concern of the administration. A visit to the VA Medical Center in Washington, D.C. was scheduled for February 16th. The memo concludes that the agencies involved were making significant efforts to improve research and services, but that statements made by department officials were often perceived as defensive and less than candid. It notes that this may be because many career employees providing information were responsible for previous decisions and were reluctant to admit mistakes, many of which were made during the previous administration. The memo concludes that given the enormous publicity and increased concerns expressed by veterans, it was essential to be more open and to let veterans and the American people know that the administration was not satisfied with the status quo. Media coverage. The memo describes extensive media coverage, including television news magazines in the United States, Canada, and Great Britain, and major articles in People, The Washington Post, and USA Today. It states that 60 Minutes was planning a story in March, with rumors suggesting the entire broadcast would be devoted to Gulf War illnesses. The memo outlines 7 major media themes, including veterans who died after being told nothing was wrong with them, veterans whose illnesses were dismissed as stress or imaginary, claims of chemical or biological exposure, despite DoD denials, illnesses following experimental drugs or vaccines, reports of ill spouses and birth defects, and mistakes by the Department of Defense. Among the mistakes listed were State Department approval for a Rockville, Maryland company to provide biological agents to Iraq before the war, pyridostigmine potentially making troops more vulnerable to sarin, and vaccines and pills administered incorrectly or too late to be effective. The memo notes that media coverage focused primarily on the suffering of veterans rather than government mistakes. It describes interviewed veterans as compelling, extremely healthy before the war, and now feeling like old men despite being in their 20s. The memo states that, for the most part, they came across as intelligent, determined, and not hysterical. Administration response challenges. The memo acknowledges that scientists and officials correctly point out that illnesses such as cancer or chronic fatigue can occur naturally, and that miscarriages and birth defects are relatively common. However, it states that official responses have often been counterproductive because they were perceived as cold-hearted and as part of a cover-up. The memo states that administration officials thus far had not conveyed the level of concern, caring, or open-mindedness that would reassure the media or the public that the human stories were being taken seriously. It emphasizes that a crucial first step was to conduct research that would help determine whether illnesses and reproductive problems were unusual in prevalence or patterns. Proposed announcements. The memo proposes 2 very public announcements. The first would be a Department of Defense press conference announcing concerns that the safety of pyridostigmine was not adequately studied under the Reagan and Bush administrations. New policies ensuring service members were adequately warned about potential side effects, and the withdrawal of the DoD request to the FDA for a permanent waiver of informed consent for experimental drugs. The second announcement would involve the President and Secretary Brown requesting that the VA Inspector General investigate allegations that some VA facilities were not providing appropriate care, announcing that the VA Persian Gulf War Hotline would compile information on problems, announcing analysis of veteran death data, including ill spouses and children in the Gulf War Health Registry, and announcing that first compensation checks for undiagnosed illnesses would be sent in February. Blue Ribbon Panel. The memo suggests creating a new blue ribbon panel with a broader mandate than the Letterberg panel. It recommends excluding members with DODVA or chemical industry contracts, including independent scientific experts, and providing sufficient staff to monitor activities for at least 1 year. It suggests focusing on a small, top-notch investigative staff advised by respected experts such as Admiral Zumwalt and a medical ethicist. Presidential Advisory Committee. Final Report, 1997. The documents include materials related to the Presidential Advisory Committee on Gulf War Veterans' Illnesses, established by Executive Order 12961 on May 26, 1995. A transmittal letter dated January 7, 1997, and signed by Committee Chair Joyce C. Lashoff, states that over 16 months, the committee conducted a broad analysis of issues believed to be consequences of Gulf War service. The letter states that overall the government responded with a comprehensive series of measures, but that these efforts were diminished by how the Department of Defense approached the possibility that U.S. troops had been exposed to chemical weapons. It states that the committee was pained by the atmosphere of government mistrust that surrounded Gulf War illnesses. The letter concludes that DoD's early efforts were superficial, lacked credibility, and adversely affected decisions related to funding research into low-level chemical exposure. It acknowledges that in November 1996, the DoD announced expanded investigations. A statement by Deputy Secretary of Defense John P. White welcomed the recommendations and emphasized expanded efforts, including the creation of the Office of Special Assistant for Gulf War Illnesses, and investigations involving more than 20,000 potentially exposed personnel at Comassia. The documents then include the action plan dated March 4, 1997, outlining outreach, research, and communication strategies, followed by President Clinton's November 5, 1997 radio address, committing to uncover all facts and act on them for veterans and their families. Conclusion. These documents reveal a government struggling to balance scientific uncertainty, veterans' suffering, and public accountability. They show extensive efforts, persistent credibility gaps, and unresolved questions that remained open years after the war. They do not provide final answers, but they document the process of recognition, response, and institutional learning. End of documentary narration.